In a hidden jungle hospital in 1969, a North Vietnamese surgeon named Dr. Tho held a captured American medical record in his hands and could not make sense of it. He was one of the finest surgeons in his army, and his army's surgeons were extraordinary. Men who performed major operations by lamplight in tunnels and bunkers with almost no equipment, under conditions unthinkable in any hospital in the world. Though had saved lives that should not have been savable, he knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what a human body could and could not survive. Because he had spent years watching bodies at the absolute edge of it, with nothing to help them but his own hands and his own judgment. And that was why the American record confused him. It described a soldier hit in the torso, a wound that, in Tho's experience, killed. Not sometimes, almost always, a man with that wound, in Tho's world, died. Because the things that would save him were things Tho did not have. And yet this record described the man being wounded in the late morning and in surgery by early afternoon and living. The times did not seem possible. The survival did not seem possible. By every rule Tho had learned in the hardest school on earth, the man should have been dead in the grass where he fell. Tho had heard the stories from his own soldiers and had not fully believed them. They said the Americans did not die the way they were supposed to. You could hit an American hard, watch him go down, and learn later that he had lived. His men found this demoralizing in a way that went beyond ordinary fear. There was something uniquely disheartening about an enemy you cannot seem to kill, even when you hit him well. And Tho, the professional, the man who understood wounds, had assumed his soldiers were exaggerating, because what they described violated everything he knew about the human body. The record in his hands said they were not exaggerating. Tho could not know the name of the soldier who had survived, and it did not matter. What mattered was the impossibility of it, the way it broke his understanding of his own craft. Because Tho was looking at the survival, but he could not see the thing that had produced it. He could see that the American had lived. He could not see how, and the how was not a miracle. And it was not tougher men, and it was not better surgeons. Tho was as good as any surgeon the Americans had. The how was a machine, an invisible machine the Americans had built around their wounded that, Tho, looking only at the result, could not see at all. Now let me show you what he was missing. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand what baffled a brilliant surgeon about the American wounded, you first have to understand the one thing that decides whether a wounded man lives or dies. And it is not what most people think. To understand what Dr. Tho could not see, you first have to understand the single most important fact about battlefield wounds, the fact that governs everything else. The great enemy of a wounded man is not the wound, it is time. This is not obvious, and it is worth explaining carefully because it is the key to the whole story. When a man is badly wounded, he does not usually die instantly. Even severe wounds, wounds to the torso, wounds that cause massive bleeding, often do not kill in the first moment. They kill over minutes and hours as the body loses blood, as it goes into shock, as infection sets in, as the cascade of failures that follows a serious injury runs its course, which means that a great many men who are mortally wounded are not, at the moment of wounding, beyond saving. They are dying, but they are not yet dead, and there is a window of minutes to hours in which the right intervention can pull them back from the edge. That window is everything. If a wounded man reaches skilled surgical care while he is still inside that window, he very often lives. If he does not, if the window closes before help arrives, he dies, even from wounds that were survivable at the moment they were inflicted. The difference between a battlefield where the wounded live and one where they die is very often not the quality of the wounds or the quality of the surgeons or the toughness of the men. It is the Speed. It is how fast a wounded man gets from the place he fell to the place he can be saved. For the entire history of warfare up to the 20th century, that journey had been slow, and so the wounded had died in enormous numbers. A man hit on a battlefield faced a long, agonizing passage to the rear, carried by comrades, jolted in a wagon or an ambulance, moved through a chain of aid stations taking hours or days to reach a surgeon capable of saving him. And in those hours and days, the window closed. Men who could have been saved bled out on the way or died of shock or developed infections that killed them before they ever reached definitive care. The great killer of soldiers across most of history was not the enemy's weapons directly. It was the time between being wounded and being treated. Now understand Dr. Tho's world, because Tho was fighting that ancient war against time and largely losing it through no fault of his own. His hospitals were hidden, dispersed, deep in the jungle or underground, deliberately far from the fighting so they could not be found and destroyed. A wounded North Vietnamese soldier faced exactly the long, slow, deadly journey that soldiers had always faced. He had to be carried, often for great distances, over difficult terrain, frequently at night, through a chain of primitive aid posts to reach a surgeon like Tho. It could take many hours. It could take days. Picture that journey because it is the whole tragedy of Tho's side in miniature. A man is hit at dawn, far out. His comrades cannot call a helicopter because they have none. So they carry him on a litter or a hammock slung under a pole or on someone's back, through jungle along footpaths, moving carefully because the sky belongs to the enemy and they must not be seen. They walk for hours. The man bleeds. They stop at a forward aid post where someone does what little can be done, and then they carry him further. Night falls. They keep moving, and somewhere on that trail, more often than anyone could bear, the man quietly crosses the line from dying to dead, and the men carrying him feel it happen, and there is nothing to be done but set him down. By the time a wounded man reached Tho, he had already survived that ordeal, which meant Tho was seeing only the ones the journey had not killed. And even many of those arrived at the very edge, hours or days past their wounding, with the window closing or already closed. Tho was a superb surgeon receiving his patients too late. He spent his war watching men die who he could have saved, if only they had reached him sooner. He did not lack skill. He lacked time, and there was no way for him to buy it. So when Tho looked at that American record and saw a man wounded in the late morning and in surgery by early afternoon, he was looking at something his entire world could not produce. He was looking at a wounded man who had reached the surgeon while the window was still open, and that, more than anything else, was the thing he could not understand. Not because he did not grasp its importance, but because he could not imagine the machine that made it possible. What Dr. Tho was missing was not a single thing. It was a system, an entire integrated machine for moving a wounded man from the battlefield to the operating table faster than had ever been possible in the history of war. And because it was a system, and because Tho only ever saw its output, he could not reconstruct it from the results. He saw survivors. He could not see the assembly line that produced them. The machine had several parts, and each one attacked the enemy of time. The first part was the man on the spot. When an American was hit, he was very often reached within minutes by a combat medic, right there in the fight, whose immediate job was to do the things that stop a wounded man from dying in the first crucial window: control the bleeding, keep the airway open, treat the shock, begin the fluids. This was not surgery. It was first aid, but it was skilled, aggressive, first aid delivered fast, and its whole purpose was to hold the window open to keep the dying man from crossing the line into death before he could be moved. The medic did not save the man. He bought time. He kept him alive long enough for the rest of the machine to work. And that idea, buying time, is worth pausing on because it is the hinge the whole system turned on. The medic was not trying to cure anyone in that paddy. He could not. What he was doing was fighting a holding action against death, keeping the dying man on the living side of the line for a few more minutes. Stop the bleeding so the man does not empty out before the helicopter comes. Keep the airway open so he does not suffocate. Start the fluids so the shock does not take him. None of it was a cure. All of it was time, minutes bought, one at a time, at the exact moment when minutes were the difference between a survivor and a corpse. Though, in his jungle hospital, almost never had those first minutes attended to, because his soldiers had no medic and helicopter chain reaching down to the point of wounding. The window that the American medic pried open and held on Tho's side simply closed out there on the trail before anyone with skill could reach the man. Same wound, same body. The only difference was whether someone was there in the first minutes to hold the door of life open until the machine could pull the man through it. The second part was the thing that made the whole system possible, the part that had no precedent in the history of warfare. The helicopter. We have talked about the helicopter before, but here is where it mattered most of all. When a man was wounded and stabilized, a call went out, and an unarmed medical evacuation helicopter dust-off came often within minutes, and it did not carry the wounded man to a nearby aid station down a road. It flew him over all the terrain that would have taken hours to cross on the ground, directly to a full surgical hospital. The journey that had killed soldiers for centuries, the slow passage to the rear, was collapsed from hours or days into minutes. This was the revolution. The helicopter did not just move the wounded faster, it changed what was survivable by getting men to surgeons while the window was still open. The third part was what waited at the other end. The Americans had built surgical hospitals well forward, close to the fighting, staffed and equipped to do major surgery immediately. And these hospitals had the two things that, combined with speed, saved the wounded: blood and surgeons ready to operate at once. A man could be lifted from a paddy and be on an operating table, receiving transfusions of whole blood with a surgeon's hands inside him in a time so short that his grandfather, wounded in an earlier war, would not have believed it. The blood mattered enormously. A man bleeding to death can be kept alive by replacing what he loses, and the Americans had blood in quantity, flown in, stored, ready. And there was a fourth part, quieter than the others but just as important: the sheer, overwhelming abundance of the whole thing. The Americans had enough helicopters that one could be spared for a single wounded man, enough blood that it could be given freely, enough hospitals, enough surgeons, enough antibiotics, enough of everything that the system could lavish an astonishing quantity of resources on saving one soldier. This abundance was itself a kind of medicine. It meant that no wounded man had to wait his turn, or be rationed, or be triaged out because there was not enough to go around. There was always enough. Put these four parts together: the medic who held the window open, the helicopter that collapsed the distance, the forward hospital with its blood and ready surgeons, and the abundance that powered all of it. And you have the machine Dr. Tho could not see. He saw its output, which was living men who should have been dead, but the machine itself was invisible to him because he stood at the wrong end of it, holding a record that showed only the result in a jungle hospital that had almost none of the things that made the result possible. Run the same wounded man through the American machine and set it beside Tho's trail, because the contrast is the whole story. The American is hit at the same dawn, with the same wound. Within minutes, a medic is on him, stopping the bleeding, starting fluids, keeping him on the living side of the line. A call goes out. Within more minutes, an unarmed helicopter is inbound. It does not pick its way along a footpath. It flies straight over everything that would have taken Tho's men a day to cross. The man is aboard and climbing, and the whole deadly distance is simply erased beneath him. 20 minutes later, he is not at a forward aid post. He is at a surgical hospital on a table with whole blood already running into his arm and a surgeon's hands already at work. He was bleeding in a paddy less than an hour ago. Now he is in surgery, inside the window, with everything he needs. That is the journey. The American did not survive because he was tougher or because his surgeon was better than Tho. He survived because the machine got him from the grass to the table before the clock ran out, the one thing Tho's side could almost never do. Here is the subtle and important part of the story. Dr. Tho was not stupid, and he was not ignorant. He almost certainly understood, in the abstract, that the Americans had helicopters and blood and forward hospitals. So why did the survival of the American wounded still baffle him? Why could such a brilliant man not simply reason his way to the answer? The reason is worth understanding because it says something true about how hard it is to grasp a system from the outside. The first reason is that Tho could not see the timeline. He received a wounded American as a prisoner, or he saw the records of one at the end of the story, not the beginning. He saw the survival. He did not see the minutes ticking by on the battlefield, the medic's hands, the helicopter's arrival, the exact interval between wounding and surgery. He knew the survival had happened, but the crucial variable, the speed, was invisible to him because it had all taken place far away and was already over by the time the evidence reached him. He was like a man shown the last page of a story and asked to explain the plot. He could see the ending. The mechanism that produced it was not on the page in front of him. The second reason is deeper, and it is a genuine limit of human understanding. It is very hard to truly grasp a system you have never experienced, especially one that works by abundance. Tho lived in a world of scarcity so total that it shaped how he thought at the most basic level. In his world, you could not spare a helicopter for one wounded man because you had no helicopters. You could not give blood freely because you had almost none. You could not build a hospital near the fighting because it would be bombed. Every instinct Tho had was shaped by not having enough, and a system built on having more than enough was so foreign to his daily reality that he could know about it and still not truly feel how it worked. He could not intuitively model a world where the answer to a dying man was simply to throw overwhelming resources at him, fast, without counting the cost, because he had never once been able to do that, make it concrete. In Tho's world, a single unit of blood was precious, almost beyond reckoning, hard to obtain, hard to store, hard to keep, and never enough. A surgeon like Tho would weigh its use, ration it, save it for the man most likely to survive, because to give it to one man was to deny it to another. That was the arithmetic of scarcity, and it was in his bones. Now try to imagine telling that man that on the other side, blood was flown in by the crate, stored in refrigerators, and poured into a single wounded soldier in quantities that would have kept several of those patients alive. It is not that Tho could not understand the words, it is that the reality behind them was so far outside his experience that it did not feel real. It was like describing rain to a man who had spent his whole life rationing every drop of water. That scarcity shaped his every instinct, and it was exactly the wrong set of instincts for understanding the American machine. Tho's mind was trained to ask, of every resource, how do I make this last? The American system was built on the opposite question. How much can we bring to bear? A man whose entire professional life had taught him to conserve simply could not easily imagine a system whose founding principle was that you never had to. The abundance was not just a fact he lacked. It was a way of thinking he had never been allowed to have. And there was a third reason, the most human one. Tho was looking for the wrong kind of answer. He was a surgeon, and so he instinctively looked for a surgical explanation, some technique, some drug, some medical secret the Americans possessed that he did not. He kept asking, in effect, what do they know that I don't? And the answer was nothing. Medically, Tho knew everything the American surgeons knew. There was no secret technique. The American surgeons were not better than Tho. In many cases, they were operating on men Tho could have operated on just as well if those men had ever reached him alive. The thing that saved the American wounded was not superior medical knowledge. It was that the wounded arrived in time and with enough blood in them to still be alive, and that had nothing to do with surgery at all. Tho was searching the operating room for an answer that lived out on the battlefield in the minutes after wounding in a helicopter he never saw. This is why the survival of the American wounded was so genuinely baffling to a brilliant enemy surgeon. It was not that the answer was complicated. In a sense, it was very simple. The Americans got their wounded to surgery fast, with enough blood to survive the trip. But the simplicity was hidden behind a system Tho could not observe, in a world of abundance he could not model, disguised as a medical mystery when it was really a logistical one. He was looking with great intelligence in exactly the wrong place. And so the thing that kept American wounded alive remained to one of the finest surgeons of that war, a genuine and demoralizing mystery. The mystery did not stay in the hospital. It reached down into the ranks, into the ordinary North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, and it did something to their morale that was subtle and corrosive and not rarely talked about. Because the survival of the American wounded was not just a medical curiosity, it was a psychological weapon, though the Americans never designed it as one. Think about what it does to a soldier to hit his enemy well and have it not count. In combat, a fighter takes enormous risks to inflict casualties. He exposes himself, spends his ammunition, risks his life, all to hit the enemy. And the entire meaning of that risk depends on the hit mattering. When you shoot an enemy soldier and see him fall, you have accomplished something at great personal cost. That is the grim arithmetic that makes the risk worthwhile. Now imagine that you keep hitting them, and they keep not dying. You ambush a patrol and drop 3 men and melt away, certain you have killed them, and weeks later you learn that all 3 are alive, patched up, some of them back in the field. The casualties you inflicted at such risk simply did not stick. The math of your war stops working. You are paying the full price to hit them and getting a fraction of the result you should, because the enemy has some way of reaching back across the line between wounded and dead and pulling his men back to the living side. This was genuinely demoralizing, and the North Vietnamese leadership understood it as a problem. It undercut one of the few advantages a guerrilla force has, which is the ability to inflict casualties and slowly wear down the enemy's will. If your casualties do not stick, if the enemy recovers most of his wounded and returns them to duty, then you have to inflict far more of them to achieve the same effect, at far greater cost to yourself. The invisible medical machine was, in effect, quietly winning back a large fraction of every fight. After the fight was over, in hospitals the guerrilla never saw. He won the ambush and lost the accounting. Sit with that phrase, because it is the quiet heart of this. There is a difference between wounding an enemy and removing him from the war, and most of history has treated them as nearly the same thing, because for most of history, a badly wounded soldier was very likely to die or be permanently out of the fight. The American machine broke that equation, Now, a serious wound often meant a few weeks or months in a hospital and a return to duty. The guerrilla was still counting in the old currency. A man down is a man gone, while the Americans had quietly changed the exchange rate. Every fight, the guerrilla thought he had done more damage than he actually had, because a large share of the men he put down simply stood back up later somewhere he could not see. Over a long war, that gap between damage inflicted and damage that stuck became enormous, and it worked against the guerrilla's entire strategy, which was to make the war cost the Americans more than they were willing to pay. He was inflicting a bill, and the machine was quietly paying part of it back in blood and helicopters and surgery before the invoice ever reached Washington. He could not see it happening. He only felt, over time, that his blows were landing softer than they should, and never quite understood why. And there was a more personal, more haunting version of it for the individual fighter. To face an enemy who does not die when he should is unnerving in a primal way. It feeds the sense that the enemy is something more than human, something that cannot be killed by ordinary means. We have seen in other stories how the North Vietnamese, a practical and unsuperstitious people, could still find themselves half believing that particular Americans could not be killed. The medical machine fed exactly this feeling on a mass scale. It was not that individual Americans were supernaturally tough. It was that the system behind them kept snatching them back from death. But to the fighter in the field, who could not see the system, the effect was the same as if the men themselves were simply maddeningly hard to kill. So the invisible machine did double work. It saved American lives, which was its purpose, and it quietly demoralized the enemy, which was not its purpose but was very real. Every wounded American who lived was a small defeat for the man who had wounded him, delivered later, out of sight, by a machine he could not fight because he could not see it. You cannot destroy a hospital you cannot find, or shoot down every helicopter, or stop the blood from flowing to the men who need it. All the guerrilla could do was hit the Americans and watch with a growing and useless frustration as fewer of them died than should have. Dr. Tho's mystery was their mystery too, and it wore on them, fight after fight, year after year. It would be easy to tell the story as another tale of American superiority, and that would be both unfair and untrue, and the truth is more interesting. Because Dr. Tho and his colleagues were, by any honest measure, among the most remarkable medical practitioners of the entire war, and the American machine, for all its power, had limits that matter. Start with the surgeons themselves because they deserve it. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong medical personnel performed feats that are genuinely astonishing. They operated in tunnels and jungle bunkers by flashlight and lamplight with improvised instruments, reusing what could not be replaced, often under bombardment. They developed extraordinary ingenuity born of scarcity, making do, substituting, inventing solutions to problems the Americans could simply buy their way out of. They saved lives under conditions that no American surgeon ever had to face, and they did it with a fraction of the resources. If you took Dr. Tho and gave him the American machine, he would have produced the same survival rates because he had the skill. The Americans had the system. The difference between them was never talent. It was supply. And here is the crucial point about what the machine could and could not do. The American medical system was superb at a specific thing, keeping alive the men who could be reached and moved in time. But it did not make the Americans win the war, and it is important to understand why, because it goes to the heart of what a medical system can and cannot achieve. Saving the wounded is a humane and enormous good, and it mattered deeply to the men whose lives were saved and to their families. But wars are not decided by casualty survival rates alone. The North Vietnamese were willing to absorb losses on a scale that the Americans, in the end, were not willing to match. And that willingness, that terrible, patient endurance, was a strategic factor that no medical machine could touch. In other words, the machine won a great many individual battles against death and lost none of them that it could reach. But the war was decided on a different plane entirely, on the plane of national will and endurance and time and politics, where the survival of wounded soldiers, however miraculous, was not the deciding factor. Dr. Tho's side lost more men and saved fewer of them, and won the war anyway, because they had decided to endure whatever it cost for as long as it took, and the Americans eventually decided they would not. The medical machine was one of the most humane and impressive achievements of the American war effort. It was not and could not be a war-winning weapon, because the thing it saved, individual lives, was not the currency in which that particular war was ultimately settled. So the honest picture is this. The Americans built a machine that kept their wounded alive at rates that genuinely baffled a brilliant enemy surgeon. And that machine was a real and remarkable thing, and it saved a very large number of young men who would have died in any previous war, and the enemy surgeons who could not match it were not inferior. They were under-resourced, and they performed miracles of their own with what little they had. And the machine, for all its power, saved lives without winning the war, because life-saving and war-winning turned out to be different things. All three of those are true at once, and holding all three is the only honest way to tell this story. Dr. Tho survived the war and practiced medicine in peacetime and lived into old age, and like many thoughtful men, he spent his later years turning over the things that had puzzled him most, and the American wounded were near the top of the list. He came in time to understand the answer, and understanding it did not diminish his respect for his enemy. If anything, it changed the shape of that respect. He had spent the war looking for a medical secret, and there had been none. The American surgeons had known nothing he did not know. What they had was the machine, the medics, the helicopters, the blood, the forward, hospitals, the abundance. And Tho came to see that the machine was, in its way, a more impressive thing than any secret technique could have been. Because a secret is a trick. The machine was an achievement built piece by piece, an entire integrated system devoted to the single proposition that a wounded soldier was worth an enormous effort to save. And that proposition was the thing Tho found himself reflecting on most. The American machine was an expression of a value, the value the Americans placed on the individual life of a single wounded soldier. They had decided that one hurt man was worth a helicopter and a unit of blood that had been flown across an ocean and a surgeon's immediate attention and all the abundance the system could bring to bear. That was a choice, a statement about what a life was worth, made concrete in steel and blood and organization. Those side had made different choices, not because they valued life less, they grieved their dead as deeply as anyone, but because they could not afford the American choices, and because their whole strategy rested on a willingness to spend lives that the Americans did not share. He thought, too, about the strange loneliness of his own position during the war, the surgeon who could see the result and not the cause. He had held those records and known that something was keeping American wounded alive and been unable to see what, because it was happening in a world he had no window into. It had felt, at the time, almost like magic, and he had resented that feeling because he was a scientist and did not believe in magic. Understanding it afterward was a relief. There had been no magic. There had been logistics, which is less romantic and more powerful. The Americans had not found a way to make men harder to kill. They had found a way to reach them before they died. And that, Tho came to think, was one of the quietest and most genuinely revolutionary things either side did in that entire war. He thought, sometimes, about how differently the war would have gone for his own wounded if his side had possessed even a fraction of that machine. All those men carried down the trails in the dark, dying somewhere between the fight and his table. How many of them would have lived if a helicopter could have reached them, if there had been blood enough, if the distance had not been allowed to kill them? He had been as skilled as any American surgeon. He was certain of that, and he was right. But skill had never been the thing that was killing his patients. Time had been killing them, and time was the one thing his side could never buy. He grieved those men differently once he understood. Not as failures of his craft, but as casualties of scarcity, men his hands could have saved, lost to a distance no one on his side could close. He never stopped being proud of what he and his colleagues had done with nothing. That pride was earned, and he held on to it. But he also never stopped marveling a little at the machine on the other side, the vast, patient, expensive apparatus the Americans had built for no other purpose than to pull their wounded back from the edge of death, again and again, faster than anyone ever had before. He had spent a war unable to understand it. In peace, he understood it, and the understanding left him with a complicated admiration for an enemy who had decided that saving one soldier's life was worth almost any amount of effort and had built the machine to prove it. Here is what Dr. Tho finally understood about the thing that kept American wounded alive and why it baffled him for so long. He had been looking for the answer in the wrong place, and so does almost everyone, because the answer is counterintuitive. When we think about why some soldiers live and others die, we think about the wound and the surgeon and the toughness of the man. Those things matter. But the thing that matters most, the thing that decides the fate of more wounded men than any other single factor, is invisible and unglamorous. It is time. It is the number of minutes between the moment a man is hit and the moment skilled hands can begin to save him. Win that race against time, and men live who should have died. Lose it, and men die who could have lived. And the Americans had built, for the first time in the history of war, a machine that reliably won the race. That is what Tho could not see, holding the record of a man who should have been dead. The survival was on the page in front of him. He assumed it meant the Americans knew something he did not, or that their men were somehow harder to kill. Neither was true. Tho knew everything the American surgeons knew. The American soldiers were not harder to kill than his own. The only difference, the entire difference, was that the American reached the operating table while he could still be saved, carried there by a system of medics and helicopters and blood and forward hospitals that collapsed the deadly distance between the battlefield and the surgeon into a handful of minutes. It was not medicine that saved the American wounded. It was speed and abundance and organization wearing the disguise of a medical miracle. And the reason it stayed a mystery to a brilliant man is the truest and most human part of the story. Tho stood at the wrong end of the machine, in a world of scarcity, looking for a surgical secret, and the answer was a logistical system, built on an abundance he had never known, operating in minutes he never witnessed, far away before the survivor ever reached his hands. He could not reconstruct the cause from the effect, because the cause was a whole invisible world away from the result. He saw living men who should have been dead, and he could not see why, because the why had already happened somewhere he would never go, in a machine he would never touch. The North Vietnamese surgeons were not lesser men. They were as skilled as any surgeons in that war, and they worked miracles with nothing, and they should be remembered for it. They lost more of their wounded, not because they were worse, but because they were poorer, because they had to fight the oldest enemy, time, without the machine that finally beat it. And their enemy had that machine, and it pulled American soldiers back from death at rates that seemed to the men on the other side to violate the rules of the human body itself. There is a lesson in that which reaches past this one war. We are used to thinking that survival on a battlefield is a matter of medicine, of what the surgeon knows and can do. And it is, partly. But Vietnam showed something less obvious and more powerful, that whether the wounded live or die is decided as much by logistics as by medicine, as much by helicopters and blood supply and organization as by the skill of any surgeon. The most important medical advance of that war was not a technique or a drug. It was a system for moving people. That is not how we usually imagine medical progress, but it is the truth. And Dr. Tho spent a war unable to see it precisely because he kept looking in the operating room when the answer was in the sky. Dr. Tho held a record of a man who should have died in the grass and who instead was in surgery within hours and lived. He looked for the secret, and there was no secret. There was only a machine that had decided one wounded man was worth everything it took to reach him in time, and reached him. That is what kept American wounded alive. Not tougher men, not better surgeons, not magic. A race against time that, for once in the long history of war, the wounded finally won. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet machines and unglamorous miracles that decided who lived and who died on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a medic, a corpsman, a dust-off crewman, a surgeon, a wounded soldier who made it home because of them, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.